Okay, got it. Okay, and we're
Great.
live.
We are live here with Stefan in Haarlem, Haarlem, the Netherlands. And
Yes.
you're originally from California. So let's just, our talks here at Pedestrian Space are super casual, and it's great to be meeting you this Sunday. I first learned about you through a TikTok video. You are at Steph the Transpo Dude. I will include that in the caption when I post this. And I
Yes.
first learned about you through a really great video where you were talking about the paving material on streets and roads. I really liked it. So yeah, let's just start right away with you are Stefan and you are in the Netherlands. And so what led to you starting this TikTok account?
Sure. So yeah, I originally from California, so 27 right now, and I got my bachelor's in civil engineering. I've been there's different specialties you can choose from, so I chose transportation engineering since a lot of people in that study first think, hey, I want to do something like structures, right? It's the first thing a lot of people think of, and then but for me, like I really liked how in transportation, you really get to see the effects it has on the community and literally brings people together. So I'm a pretty big extrovert. I like being around people. So I thought, hey, I'd love to build a career around building the systems that connect different people together, right? And so I worked as a civil engineer in the US for almost 2 years. Long story short, got quite frustrated with the industry and how we do things in the US. I felt like I was kind of learning the wrong lessons. So I'm half German as well. So my mom is German citizenship, as I do as well. So I thought, how cool would it be if I could go to a leader in the space of mobility, like bicycles and public transit. So I decided to make the career move to go to the Netherlands instead of try to work and learn from some of the best planners and engineers in the world. So the TikTok and the YouTube account I run are about trying to share some of the more technical aspects of how they do city planning and engineering here, and then try to share that with a wider audience for people who are interested in that kind of thing. So it's a little bit like there's a really common YouTube channel called Not Just Bikes. A lot of people in our space know about it. And what I'm trying to do is something similar, but a little more focused on the technical side of things. So if people want to know, like, well, what's the engineering use of this material versus this material, right? How does the math actually work, right? What are some of the more technical reasons for why we do certain things? So, and ultimately what I'd love to do is try to use that to push the technical profession in North America in the right direction. Since I think personally, a lot of the issues we have in North America are the engineering profession's fault. And I think that a lot of the solutions will ultimately start with them when they codify proper practices.
And by right direction, what do you mean by that?
So right direction, what I mean is moving away from very top-down planning where cities and counties will release these master plans where the work tends to be very slow and inefficient and not very organic. And then it tends to disproportionately focus on the automobile. And in those plans, there's a lot of standardized practices that don't work well and are proven not to work well, but they just keep doing it because it's what they've done forever and they don't know how to do anything else. Or they're just not willing to be the first to do something different.
Right. Okay, so about about the account, I love how you're using that to kind of communicate about the technical aspects. And of course, it's TikTok, so you're reaching a lot of people who, day to day aren't necessarily thinking about this. So what's the engagement been like there?
It's been almost overwhelmingly positive. So there's kind of two people. The crowd I'd say are two kinds of people. One are Dutch people who just notice there's this American guy walking around this, their town when they're talking about the city, and a lot of them are curious because they grew up there and they never, thought about it that way, right? So a lot of them are saying, hey, you're kind of giving me a new perspective on my city, on the country I live in, and kind of getting me to understand some of the things I took for granted. Then the others are probably people who follow other TikTok accounts. I call it urban talk. Like basically, there's a lot of TikToks out there who focus on urban planning, land use, mobility, like, we have TikTok channels like Pedestrian Dignity, right? Yes, in my backyard. So I quite often get people who are coming from those channels, since it's probably the algorithm pushing them that way. And then you also just get just people who just pop in completely randomly, and they're like, well, I don't know what this guy's doing, but I like it, so I'm just gonna follow him.
Yeah, I'm just recently learning about this. I think I set up a TikTok account after seeing your video, actually, and yeah, following Pedestrian Dignity. I recently chatted with Mr. Barricade, who's doing a similar thing. So
Yeah,
it's like there's this whole new, it feels new, media ecosystem that seems to be developing with people that are like you, an engineer. It's obviously not a new profession, but it feels like a new type of media. And this whole ecosystem around what you call urban talk, people using these platforms, these very new
yeah,
platforms to discuss these issues, which is super exciting. Yeah. And I like what you said about Dutch people also following and getting a new perspective on things they took for granted. In my recent editor's letter at Pedestrian Space, I mentioned this because in the last city I lived in Sweden, there was things I was noticing all the time, like bike pumps strategically placed throughout the city. So what a
yeah,
great way to, support people, not just people with bicycles. I often had to pump the wheels of my kid's stroller. It's just so practical. It's like not really even innovative. It's just super common sense. But when I would
yeah,
post these things and people in other countries would say, wow, I wish we had that in our community, I remembered the things you take for granted often in your own community are what is so desperately maybe needed in another. And so part of what we do at Pedestrian Space too is what we're trying to do is like make this global platform to share these ideas because they're often really simple things. Um,
yeah. And a lot of for the Dutch, they just say, well, cycling, it's just what we do here. We've always cycled everywhere, and I mean that's true. Like, it is a flatter country. They have had more of a cycling tradition, but that whole way of life became seriously jeopardized after World War II, when they started building out their freeway system. They started centering their urban planning around the car in the 50s and the 60s. And Amsterdam, for example, there was a plan to fill in all Amsterdam's canals with arterial roads, for example.
wow.
And
Wow.
it almost went through. It was defeated by like 2 votes, like at the city council,
Wow.
after a huge amount of protest and advocacy. And then that's kind of what started the whole 40-year process that's been going on now of getting more people to cycle, right? So it's what they're writing on is 40 years of consistent advocacy and engineering work, right? And those two things reinforcing one another. So it's, I mean, yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, you can also say, like, yeah, people cycle in America, but you would never see the kind of percentages that you see over here if you didn't have that kind of infrastructure.
Right. So you have the infrastructure and it's also just it's a way of life. It's a lifestyle. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing is that something I learned after moving here is that the Dutch word for cyclist that we understand, they say fietser, right? Which is, if you try to kind of literally translate it, it's kind of like someone who walks fast. So it's like it's seen more as a faster form of walking, right? If you just have people who are just kind of casually cycling on their upright bicycles. But the people who do it for sport, right? The people who wear the spandex and the helmets and everything, they call them wheel runners. And those, they're almost that's almost like your vehicle, right? So they're like in the language, they're fundamentally different things, right? So they're
Right.
treated quite differently. Yeah. So everyone's like, well, I feats, like why wouldn't you, feats? But
Right.
I'm not a wheel runner. I know why would I get decked out in all the sport gear and then go
Right.
racing?
Right.
So it's like it's kind. I guess if I had to compare it, it would be like driving in America versus being a NASCAR driver. They're just
Mhm.
seen as completely different things by the language.
Right. Yeah, and that the language is part of the mobility culture, which, we were talking about the difference in European countries too, not lumping all of Europe together before I started recording. And it's really interesting to look at the different like language related to mobility culture in different countries. So why did you choose Harlem as a
What?
place to live?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, actually, Harlem was a bit of a coincidence. So I when I first moved, I spent 3 months in The Hague, which is on the kind of the western edge of the Netherlands. Actually, my plan was to originally stay there because it's really close to this really nice beach area called Scheveningen. So there you have a really nice city center. You have a lot of the government buildings, and you have a beautiful beach that's 15 minutes away with a bicycle. So you have a lot of different things. But I was at that time I was job hunting. I was like trying to get my life set up there, and I was in the Netherlands. It's like you get caught in this loop because you need to get housing right to get registered, right? But to get registered, you need an address, right? So like, you get caught in this vicious loop. So
Yeah.
like a lot of people get an Airbnb, right, and then they'll get registered, and then they'll find something permanent. I was in an Airbnb in The Hague. I was having a trouble finding something permanent that wasn't hugely expensive. So there was a lady who was helping me, and she found this amazing deal in Haarlem. I thought, okay, well, I'll keep an open mind. I'll check it out. Came here, fell in love with the town. I love living in Haarlem. It's like a much smaller version of Amsterdam. It's less crazy all the time, and it feels very cozy.
Hmm.
So yeah, I signed a lease, and been here ever since for around I think 7 months now, 7 to 8 months now. And
It
I like it
sounds
so much that I'd rather stay here and then do that hour-and-a-half train ride versus moving.
right. Your commute is an hour and a half, which you were saying is kind of nuts for local. Like
Yeah,
most people
yeah,
would see
yeah.
that as super long, but you were saying for you it's a really productive time.
Yeah, in the train, I'll read through. So I'm currently trying to read through a lot of the Dutch engineering tech standards because I'm trying to learn all of the rules that govern the profession and all the technical advice. And it's also a good way to improve my Dutch since they're only available in Dutch. So usually on the train, that's when I'll try to take 40 minutes, as much as my brain can handle, and I'll try to read through different kinds of books. Let's actually have one here. I can show you. Looks like this. Like it's in Dutch, but
Okay, yeah.
it's saying like the handbook for the general design of paths, right?
Okay.
So yeah, it's for me, it's a great time to work on my Dutch and then also improve my technical knowledge here. So that's what I came here to do.
That's really great. And I love talking about it's one of my maybe one of my favorite topics related to public transit is talking about what do you do on public transit, like when you're used to maybe coming from a life where you're car dependent. When you're driving, you shouldn't be
Yeah,
doing anything else but driving, right? Maybe listening,
yeah,
maybe listening to music or whatever, talking to somebody. But when you switch to public transit, you suddenly have time free to do whatever you want. And I love to, for example, I often have that as my reading time. I can get so much reading done in public transit. So I think that's really neat hearing about how you have um, a good chunk of time to. I guess
yeah.
that's how you learn Dutch so quickly. You learn Dutch really quickly, it seemed.
Yeah. I came here. I did take some Duolingo before I came here when I was still living in the States, but it was just very much the basics. I guess it was because of a necessity because I knew that a lot of jobs when you come to the Netherlands, you don't really need to speak Dutch since they do business in English. But it seems like I chose the one profession where, well, most of this work is done for cities, right? And these cities serve Dutch people, and there's no way they're going to tell their own citizens like, "Oh, sorry, you have to talk English at your own city public meeting,"
Right,
right?
right,
So yeah, I basically chose the one profession where Dutch fluency is an absolute must.
right.
So I guess
Interesting.
I just became very motivated, and then I I did a couple of interviews with different companies, and basically what they all told me at the time was, "Hey, yeah, we're interested, but your Dutch just isn't good enough yet." And then I did 2 interviews for Arcadis, and then after the second, they were like, "Yeah, we're thinking about it, but we're kind of worried about your language skills." And then I said, "Hey, how about this? What if we did an interview 3 months from now, and let's do the whole interview in Dutch, right? And if I do the interview in Dutch, then consider that." So they said, "Okay, we'll do that." And so that was pretty much the beginning of the time where I just taught, I just slept, breathed, and just did everything I possibly could in Dutch, right? Like I was watching the films, I was watching Dutch TikTok lives, I was making people only speak with me in Dutch. Like I try to live the language as much as I could, and I was able to do that interview pretty much all in Dutch. So that was like a huge. It was a lot of sacrifice, right? But I think if you really are forced to, it's amazing how much of a different language you can learn. different
Right.
that quickly. Yeah.
That should inspire me with Polish, maybe. Yeah.
If you don't need it in Sun City, it's a little bit harder, I would say.
Right.
Like
If
a
you
little
need
bit,
it, the motivation, right, is there.
yeah. It's like yeah. I would say I would say that, yeah. And then back to the public transit thing, it's funny because for me on Friday, my weekend actually starts on the train because I'll crack open a beer on the train. Because in the
Right.
Netherlands, you can drink at the stations, you can drink on the train. It's
Right.
not really a problem. So I was like, yeah, I'll start my weekend with the beer on the train while I'm on my hour and a half ride home.
Oh, that's so great. You should send me a picture of that. I would love that because I love having pictures of how people enjoy their train time. That's really great for like the Friday feeling.
There was a time when I took a German train, and this, the ICEs in Europe,
Mhm.
the fast trains. Well, this train ended up breaking down right between the German and Dutch border because something I don't know, something went wrong with the voltage switch. We were stuck there for like 3 hours, right?
Mhm.
So what did everybody do? Well, everyone went to the cafe cart and started buying beer, right?
Yeah.
So we had like a couple hundred German people just having a party on the train, drinking beer, and I thought that was pretty awesome.
Yeah, that is pretty awesome. That's not a bad way to pass a train snafu. Okay, really quick. Also the why I wanted to know about with your TikTok. So like, do you, like, what motivates you to share all these things, and also like where you record them? Are you recording in Harlem or in the city of your company, or both? A little mix.
Sure. So the why is that I think that the engineering profession, the traffic engineering, the transportation engineering profession, is kind of a bit of still in the dark ages. I think that there's a big gap of knowledge between us and our peers over in Europe, especially in the Netherlands. I think that a lot of our practices need to be upgraded to current times, and I thought that my way of doing that would be to explore what they do over here in Europe, and then also explore these kind of texts, and then break it down for an American engineer and say, no, this is why the American way of doing things is wrong. This is the kind of standard we should use instead. So I'm trying to expose a lot of the technically minded people to something different, because a lot of the kind of work in this field is done by advocacy groups, which I think is fantastic, and we need that. But I think what we also need is advocacy people, and the engineers kind of often fight against one another, especially at council. And I think that if we had engineers who were kind of fluent in this stuff, who can kind of make a case in the language and other engineers could understand, that would also do a lot as well. So I think that on one side you have a lot of the advocacy people pushing the mayor, the city councils to make progressive, reforms, but I also think that having a little few more technical channels where we're actively engaging with those technical professionals to make them understand, like, hey, no, you guys, there's no reason for you two to fight. Like, you guys actually probably have similar goals. It's just kind of the lack of education, especially on the professional side, that's stopping a lot of that from happening.
Wow, it's really interesting. That is going to inspire me to want to engage also welcome more technical professionals and engineers to talks like this. So
Yeah.
in the future, if you have any tips about that, I would love that. That's what you just said is really food for thought for engagement
Yeah.
moving
Well,
forward.
it's because, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was done.
Well, because in the American university system, so transportation is a subfield of civil engineering. So there's 5 general branches. You've got structures, you've got water, you've got geotechnical, then you also have, and then transportation. I think that was 5. So it's part of a larger program. So you spend at least 2 years doing all of your regular engineering classes. Then you're required to take at least one class in each specialty. And then the idea is you kind of focus on one, and that's the one you go into. And that kind of works for some of them. Like if you're going to structures, right? You only need a class or two to get the exposure, but they all kind of work off of the same booklet, and it's a very technical profession. So you learn universal rules about structures. You learn about the design. We call them the things like the steel Bible, right? Where it's like this engineering book about how steel design works. And so for some of the very technical professions that works, but for things like transportation, all we take is one class. It's called Introduction to Highway Engineering. And then if you're lucky, you might take one or two electives, possibly. So like when I was in school, I took Introduction to Highway Engineering, and then I took a traffic planning class. And with those two classes, I'm now supposed to go out and work as a professional, in the transportation field. And then when you're on the job, what you tend to learn are how to use programs like AutoCAD, and then how to learn some of the standards, right? So all these rules that they came up with in the 1950s. So it's like when it actually comes to like the knowledge, right, and the theory, the ugly truth is that a lot of the professionals don't have much of a better understanding than just regular people. What we do have is a good knowledge of the standards, right, and the software. So we know a lot on how to actually build it, but we don't often understand what we're actually building, how it's actually going to solve problems. Like we never actually learn in school, oh, hey, how do you actually fix traffic? Like you would think that if you're a traffic engineer, that would be the first thing you learn, but you don't. You learn, okay, well, here's how you do a traffic study. Here are some of the parameters and the measurements we do, and then they just send you along your way. And then one thing I want to do is I'm an advocate for, I think that transportation should be actually separated from the civil profession, since I think there's so much to learn that in order to become professional in it, you need at least probably 10 to 15 classes instead of just two.
Yeah.
And yeah. Or you need some kind of extra certificate or something like that. Because if you have these people in charge of our streets and roads, there's so much more than just what's going on with the cars, right? Like if someone messes up a road in the city, that can kill dozens of people. It can destroy a city's culture. Like I think the stakes are also extremely high. But it's not as obvious as in a way like if someone built a building and then the building fell down, right? That's super obvious. Like, oh, hey, well, someone messed up right there. But when it comes to things like streets and roads, it happens over a much longer time span. So it's less obvious, but it's just as significant.
About the education portion, what you're referring to is kind of the North American model of
Yes.
education, and it's different.
Yeah.
Like in the Netherlands, they have specific track, like at the bachelor's level for transport engineers.
Yes. So they do they have a degree called the HBO, which is kind of their equivalent for a Bachelor of Science, and that's actually something I'm trying to learn more about. So I'm working on a new YouTube video comparing the three kinds of traffic services, but after that, I wanted to write an article comparing those two education systems
Okay.
because I'm trying to make the very unpopular case in North America that we don't really know what we're doing, and people who've been working the professions 10 to 15 years don't tend to react well to that truth or reality, right? That's so often why, like if you go to a city council meeting in North America, the traffic engineer will just cite some passage out of the MUTCD, or they'll cite some arbitrary rule, and they do that because that's all they know. That's all they've been trained in. So that's always what they default back to. Because if they don't have that, they don't have much else. Because they were never taught the basic fundamental knowledge I think you need to have a good system.
It's really so great what you're doing, because I think it's also different when it's one of your own saying that, and kind of like wanting to make that shift from the inside, rather than you said earlier about advocates and engineers often be at odds. For me to approach a panel of engineers and saying you're doing it all wrong, it's a different message than when it's coming from, I think, a fellow engineer also who says, look, there's this other way, you speak the same language, you have the same or similar training. So I like to talk about that mobility paradigm shift, and it requires a change from all areas of the spectrum. So that's really interesting to hear about, that you are comfortable also making that case, because it probably puts you in an uncomfortable position sometimes. People don't always like to hear that, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's something that I kind of I'm a little more open about it now, because back when I was working for an American company, I was a little more cautious because I didn't want there to be a bit more blowback. But now than being over here and being a bit more independent, I try to make that case as much as I can. Yeah, it's kind of mixed. I've noticed when it comes to younger people, they tend to be a lot more open to it. Whereas when you have people who've been there 20, 30 years, a lot more often it's like, oh, who's this young kid? He doesn't know anything about, how dare you
Right, right,
tell me, I've been doing my job wrong for 30 years.
right.
Like, well, I mean, I just say, well, let's look at the numbers. Deaths are up, or pedestrian deaths are up. Traffic deaths haven't budged for 10 years, right? Vehicle miles traveled are up. Like, where is the evidence that your approach has worked? Of everything
Mhm.
we've done the past 30 years. And that's also why I'm very numbers focused, because I think that people generally understand numbers,
Mhm.
and if you can make your case, if you can make your case with the numbers, that's just the best way to appeal to as broad of an audience as possible.
Right. Maybe also particularly engineers like numbers. Like I like stories, but I also understand the importance of numbers, and we need both so much, right? Without the numbers, I mean, it would be very difficult to make some of these changes. I feel like so that's really important. I often like to do something which is completely unscientific, but I think it's
Okay.
fun. And I ask you to rate your city. So I guess maybe you're going to do Harlem. I ask you to rate on a scale of 1 to 10. So 1 is least walkable, 10 would be like perfect walkability. So let's start with walkability. What would you rate Harlem for walkability?
Harlem for walkability, I'd give that probably a solid 9, 8.5 to a 9, probably.
That's
Uh,
pretty good.
the reason why I don't give it a perfect 10 is because Harlem has kind of distinct zones, and there's if you look at the central train station, when you go south, it's really interesting. When you go south of the train station, you have a big courtyard, there's a bus stop, everything's older style, everything's super walkable. But if you go out on the north side of the station, there's immediately a regional road, right? And Harlem gets a little bit more of a American suburbia feel if you go off to the
Okay.
northeast a little bit. And so the
Okay.
distances tend to be a little further. Yeah. And there's even like a little American style strip mall, like a couple kilometers from
Oh,
where I live.
weird.
But
Huh?
there's like, that's pretty much the only one.
Okay.
So, but it's overall very good. Very good.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, so cycling.
Cycling, yeah, it's got to be a 10.
That
It's got to be a
gets
10.
a 10. Wow.
Yeah,
Okay, I have to come there and cycle.
yeah, no, there's I mean, there are always things that can improve. Like there are some areas I don't really like, but just all the attention investment that's been made in it, it's as perfect as I think you're gonna get in the present times.
Okay, and I guess some of your TikTok videos show that, like all the best practices in terms of the cycling infrastructure and culture and everything.
Yeah, like just last week I made a video about how they doubled the amount of parking spaces. So they had an overflow lot, and then over like a week they just came and they put in double tier bike racks on that lot. So now they doubled the number of bike parking
Wow,
spots right in the central station. So
cool.
kind of going back really quick, they have a really interesting model here where they combine cycling and transit together. So you see these massive bike parking stations at train stations
Mhm.
because they realize, hey, no, you can't go super far on a bicycle practically, but you can with the train, right? So if we could combine those two, that would knock out the most number of car trips, and that's what they've been pursuing here.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so the last one then is public transit. 1 to 10.
Public transit. Out of 10, you know what? I would put public transit in the Netherlands probably. Like Haarlem, I would probably put it at a 7.5. Not it's very good. It's very frequent. Very clean. But I would say the one thing I don't like about Dutch public transit is it's quite expensive,
Oh, it is.
and it can be, yeah. So like for example, if I wanted to take a train to Amsterdam, right? That's, for a rather 15-minute ride, that's €5 one way.
Oh,
And
well.
then if I didn't have a subscriber plan, if I just had to buy it, right? So that's €10. €10, every single day, that's €300, right? And yeah, it can, I mean, it's okay because then a lot of people cycle, but I think that when you have expensive public transit, it takes some of the public part out of it. I
Right.
think they should find ways to improve it. Yeah, but the consistency and the quality of it is very good.
Yeah, that's great. those are some strong scores. So a lot to look at in Haarlem.
Yeah.
We're going to close out here, and I look forward to watching more of your videos. And I'm taking to heart some of the things you said too about advocates and engineers cooperating more, listening to each other more. So I'm hoping to engage more and yeah, to communicate with you more as well about the work you're doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for the time and the chat. It was great to connect with like-minded people, especially places like all the way to Poland.
But two California natives here in Europe. Yeah.
Yeah. Two Californians, one Netherlands, one in Poland.
One in Poland, yeah. All
Be
right.
like a podcast title.
It should be. Yeah. All right. Thank you.